Today on Up Front, chaos on Capitol Hill. A mob of President Trump supporters stormed the Capitol on the day Congress met to certify Joe Biden's election win.
This is banana republic crap that we're watching happen.
But then when we witnessed the guns being drawn and pointing at the doors, that's when the cold, sober reality set in for me that, my God, this could be a bloodbath.
Next, the Wisconsin congressman who had to shelter in place. Is the president to blame for this violence? And do the congressmen support impeaching President Trump for a second time?
Taking on the issues important to Wisconsin. This is Up Front with your host, Adrian Pedersen.
There's been nothing like it in modern American history. A mob loyal to President Trump overran barricades and police and stormed the U.S. Capitol building on Wednesday, all in an attempt to stop congressional certification of the election that Joe Biden won. The violence left 5 people dead, including a Capitol police officer. Democrats and even some Republicans accused President Trump of egging on his supporters. We still have so many questions, and we're talking about it today with 2 Wisconsin congressmen. We'll start with the Green Bay area Republican Mike Gallagher. First of all, Congressman, thank you for joining us. And I just want to say that I'm so glad that you're okay with everything that happened. It had to be terrifying. And I do want to get to the firsthand account from you in a minute. But let's start with what it seems to be everybody is talking about. Do you want to see Vice President Mike Pence move forward with the 25th Amendment to make sure that the president is out of office soon?
I'm not yet convinced that that's the best for the country. I think what we learned on Wednesday, January 6th, which is the day that will live in infamy, is that the country is barely being held together right now. It's a tinderbox. I think political violence is off the charts this year, and Wednesday was another act of political violence. And so I think all of us in public office have to consider what we can do, if nothing else, not to contribute to the cycle of escalation. And I just worry that using the next 12 days to settle political scores as opposed to reinforcing the peaceful transition of power is not the right thing for the country right now. And I say that as someone who right now is angry, very angry with my colleagues who persisted in objecting, persisted in telling the American people a dangerous lie that somehow Congress was going to overturn the results of the election on January 6th. I mean, the president repeated that lie the morning at the rally before the event and told people that Pence was going to somehow change the results, and Pence obviously disagreed. And so that angers me, but I think we all got to figure out what we can do to contribute to a little bit of national reconciliation rather than political retribution.
So are you saying that you're concerned what people would do if the 25th Amendment is invoked? Is that why you don't know if you can support it?
I'm concerned, I think, less about, that we'll see a repeat of January 6th, though that's entirely possible. I'm concerned that the objectors might not learn any lessons if that's the route we go down. And they'll just say, see, the left is exploiting this for political purposes, and you can't trust these people. We got to dig in. We got to resist, et cetera, et cetera. When I think the lesson is the opposite. I think the lesson for conservatives is there's no behavior on the far left that justifies ignoring the Constitution. There's nothing. There's no behavior that ever justifies political violence. And if nothing else, we all have a duty as public servants to be honest with our constituents. And the argument I heard behind closed doors by scores of my colleagues this week was a very cynical one. It was, we know this is bad precedent. We know it has no chance of succeeding, but we have to go along with it in order to pretend like we're fighting so we won't get a primary challenge. I mean, that's a very disingenuous and a very cynical way to approach politics. And so right now I'm thinking through how do we get people to realize that that type of politics shouldn't have a place in the Republican Party. And there's a division in my party right now, and I'm just not someone who's out to expel people because I disagree with them. And even though I'm really angry right now, I'm trying to take a step back and do what I can to exhibit a little bit of grace, just because I don't know how else we prevent this escalation of political hatred.
Well, what about impeachment? That's another thing on the table here. Do you support impeaching the president?
Well, I sort of view it the same way, right? It's an effort to settle the score, and I just think I'm not convinced that would actually bring the country back together right now. I'm not sure what the best path forward is. I really not, and I never thought I would be sitting in my office with the doors barricaded, talking with my two staffers there about whether we could use the Wisconsin flag and the pole that it's hanging on as a defensive weapon in the event that rioters broke down the door. But that's where we were on Wednesday, and I'm still trying to think through what I can do to contribute to a more productive politics going forward.
I guess I should just ask you, do you support President Trump going forward? I mean, he has made it clear that he wants to come back in 2024. Do you support him?
I think it's going to be hard for me to support anyone who was part of the objection.
So you're saying him. You're saying him specifically. You couldn't support.
Well, I think it goes beyond him, right?
What about Ron Johnson?
There's 64% of my colleagues that took part in this, and I don't think I can vote for Republican leaders who took part.
What about Senator Ron Johnson? What do you think about him?
Well, Ron, I think he withdrew his objection, and I have a very close relationship with Ron, and I know him to be a man of high integrity. And should he choose to run again, I'll be in his corner, and I'm glad that he didn't go forward. I think Ron started from a position of sincerely wanting to investigate election fraud, and I understand that.
But he didn't perpetuate that narrative of voter fraud?
What's that?
He didn't perpetuate that narrative of voter fraud, and then he said he would object, and the only reason it sounds like he didn't is because what happened on Wednesday.
Well, I think that's the critical breaking point, right? There were objectors that continued objecting after we had loss of life in the Capitol, and that I don't fundamentally understand. I mean, what happened on Wednesday was crazy. It was crazy, right? I mean, I've never, as I said, the closest parallel was stuff I've seen in Iraq. I think we all need to take a step back and think about the future of the country. And I'd be lying to you if I had all these answers figured out right now.
And Congressman,
I'm trying to reflect.
I think we have time for one last question. So I understand your point, and you came out strong on Wednesday telling the president that he had to do something to call people off. But do you wish you would have done something sooner? I mean, we can't say that we're shocked that this happened based on all the signs. So do you wish you would have done something sooner?
I wish that I would have more forcefully argued against my colleagues that were pushing this January 6th narrative. And honestly, I just thought it was not going to get any steam because I didn't think a senator would object. And I think that quickly spiraled out of control when Senator Hawley was the first to object and the dam broke. And I think, if I could say this, I think like a lot of Americans, I've struggled to understand what's true and what isn't over the last 2 months. It poisoned a lot of personal relationships I had because I didn't believe in the Dominion conspiracy theories, and it took an enormous toll on my own personal life and my family life. So I wish I'd found a way to be more persuasive, or at least convince people that they shouldn't trust everything they read on Parler just because it confirms a narrative they want to believe.
Congressman, yes, it's certainly my job and your job to get the facts out there. So I appreciate your time today. And again, I'm so glad you're okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And you can see more of my interview with the congressman on our website, the upfront section of WISN.com. I asked him about the future of the Republican Party post President Trump. A second impeachment of the president on the table next. Democratic Congressman Ron Kind on going ahead with that with just days left in the president's term.